And the biggest jump you make as a player oftentimes is from year 1 to year 2. They were already good in year 1. I can only imagine what they're going to look like in Wes Goodwin's system this year. So I think Clemson is poised to make a big leap defensively. Now it's just about whether or not their offense can follow suit. Hello and welcome to Always College Football. I'm Greg McElroy. Today is Monday, May 20th, 2024. We hope that you're enjoying the show, whether you're getting the show, whether it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the ESPN YouTube channel. We have seen all of you leaving ratings and reviews the last couple weeks. Our ratings are continually starting to go up. We've also seen a couple of you that continue to leave 1-star reviews. We appreciate you as well. All of you Florida State fans that I've been telling you about, those that went and sabotaged the rating, it's perfectly fine by us because you're still listening. And if you're still rating and leaving reviews for the show, that means you're still listening. So we appreciate you, even though you are intentionally trying to drop our rating either way. We're still having a good time with it, though. And we appreciate all of you pushing back, fighting, and defending the podcast because we've been working hard on it for a couple years. And we will continue to work hard on it here as the offseason progresses. Mark Kubiak is not here, but Jack Foster and Jake Garcia are. We have a great show on tap for you today. As what we decided, and I think Jack Foster, credit to him on this, and yes, his team, the Tennessee Volunteers, will be on the list, so we will talk a little Tennessee. But our goal in this show is to dive in just a little bit on some teams that seem to be flying under the radar a little bit. Now, some of you will listen to some of the teams that we go through and say they're not under the radar. I'm just talking more in the sense that this team might be able to do more than what the average people are thinking. And I think to another extent, they're kind of understood to be good in some cases. And maybe other teams are overshadowing these teams, but don't sleep on these squads because they got some juice in some spots that we will dive into. So without much further ado, let's dive in. Teams that we have not talked about enough so far this offseason. Now, some of you might roll your eyes when we start on the top where we're going to start. But you have to take things into account here. Part of it is based on how much conversation should be centering around these teams, right? So a little bit's based on expectations. A little bit's based on maybe there's other teams that have kind of stolen the spotlight for whatever reason. So when we start with the Georgia Bulldogs, you'll understand I still think that universally speaking, people have Georgia at worst, the number 2 team in college football coming into the season. But how much time? Seriously, I've looked back through my notes. I've looked back through our shows that we've done, and we've talked way less about the Georgia Bulldogs this year compared to where they were the year before and the year before that. Way less. Now, why is that? Well, partly because Alabama had a coaching change. Partly because Georgia's just kind of a plug and play. They got so many pieces back. There's not a ton of question marks. They don't have a crazy quarterback competition going on right now. You kind of know that Georgia's going to be in the mix. And the other team that would be right alongside them in the mix at the top of the college football rankings this summer is Ohio State. And Ohio State has had such a tremendous offseason with the additions that they made in the portal by adding Chip Kelly to become their offensive coordinator. Ohio State has captured almost all of the attention there at the top when deciding between who's 1 and who's 2. And we just haven't spent a lot of time talking about Georgia. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about having to replace Brock Bowers. We haven't talked about having to replace Ladd McConkey. We haven't spent enough time documenting one of the biggest transfer portal additions in the entire portal window, and that would be Trevor Etienne. We talked a ton about Quinshon Judkins going from Ole Miss to Ohio State, but we haven't talked that much about Etienne, who might be as good of an all-purpose player as there is in the SEC. We haven't talked about the development of Dylan Bell and how he might be the next version of Brock Bowers. Now, you're going to say he doesn't play tight end. I understand that. But the versatility that Dylan Bell has showcased in his Georgia career is pretty remarkable, right? A guy was a slot receiver and an outside receiver. And then, hey, we have some running back depth issues. Let's just move you back to running back and hand you the ball. That's what Dylan Bell is capable of. Carson Beck's the best quarterback in the country, according to a lot of experts, and everyone that is kind of documenting the NFL draft for next year has Carson Beck at number 1 or number 2 or number 3, depending on how you shake out. Haven't talked that much about the defense, a group that at times last year on the edges of the defense were somewhat unrecognizable. And I'm talking about the games against Missouri, when the stretch zone just hit them time and time again, the game against Georgia Tech where they got gashed on the ground, the game against Alabama where they got pushed back off the line of scrimmage as well. We haven't talked about those things. Partly because I think some of those things will be shored up this year. Mykel Williams will be at 100% from day one, which is huge. Might be the best edge defender in the SEC when he's at 100%. And then some of the kind of losses and the people that have been lost on defense the last couple of years, Javon Bullard, Malachi Starks is going to be right there. He's going to be just fine. Kamari Lassiter, no problem. Next man up. So I think Georgia's kind of flying under the radar in a weird way, aren't they? For a team that's going to be ranked number 2 and at worst, maybe number 1 going into the season, we just haven't talked about them enough. I can promise you we'll make right on that bet, though, because we're going to talk about them a lot moving forward, because we need to spend more time on a team that could very easily win their 3rd national championship in 4 years. Team that is arguably the alpha dog program in the sport. Pun intended, of course. DAWG. Moving on now. A team that was formerly in the division alongside Georgia, but the SEC is doing away with divisions. A team that might have crazy upside this offseason because of the likely improved play that they're going to get at the quarterback spot. And while I think that Nico Iamaleava might have a growing pain or two, I think you can make a case right now, his mobility, his acceleration, his ability to drive the ball down the field, ability to be a little bit more accurate on some of the underneath stuff. He's got a change up, unlike Joe Milton, his predecessor. I look at Tennessee, and while I think Tennessee fans are bullish about a possible playoff spot, I don't feel like Tennessee's really captured the nation's attention. Kind of like what we talked about with Georgia. There isn't really a quarterback competition. There aren't a ton of question marks that you have on defense. They have James Pierce back. If not for Mykel Williams, who I mentioned a moment ago with the Georgia Bulldogs, you make a case that James Pierce might be the best edge defender in the SEC. And statistically speaking, last year he was, alongside Dallas Turner and a few others. So I think you look at the SEC right now, and everyone's talking about Alabama, Georgia to an extent, even though Georgia, like I said, kind of flying under the radar. Tons of conversation about the Texas Longhorns. Tons of conversation to be had about the Ole Miss Rebels and the offseason that they've had. But there's not a whole lot of discussion about what Tennessee might ultimately be. And if their quarterback play skyrockets, they could be as dangerous a team as there is in the Southeastern Conference. I feel like I've spent more time talking about Florida this offseason than I have Tennessee. Partly because there's been conversation about Billy Napier and the hot seat and the pressure and all the other things. We need to spend a little more time on the Volunteers moving forward. Because with elevated quarterback play, if we think about what they were statistically last year, we went through this a couple weeks back. Tennessee lost from 22 to 23 about 78 yards of offense a game. They went from first way on down the list. I think they were 40s in that vicinity. That was 78 yards of offense per game that they lost from 22 to 23. Well, you know how many yards passing they lost last year from 22 to 23? That was 83 yards. So you could almost pin all of Tennessee's inconsistencies on the passing game. So with a slightly improved passer, assuming Nico Iamaleava is, and a running game that's going to continue to be dynamic, and a defense that is shown to be really solid, Tennessee could definitely challenge at the top of the league, and yet nobody really has them in that discussion right now. I think most people would have Tennessee 5th in the SEC, maybe 6th coming into the season, depending on how you want to shake things out between Texas, Bama, Georgia, LSU, Missouri, Ole Miss, and Tennessee. Those are probably your top 7. Tennessee, I feel like, is way on down the list as far as the amount of coverage they're getting this offseason, and maybe that's good for them because they did not handle the expectations as well last year as one would have liked. Moving on to a team that last year we were very high on. We got this one wrong, ladies and gentlemen. Not going to sit here and try to tell you that we didn't. We were high on Wisconsin going into the season, and we were really fired up. And when we looked at kind of back at why, we thought, hey, this could look a little bit like TCU from 2022 because, hey, it's kind of things had gotten stagnant, things had gotten predictable. Maybe with this new infusion of offense, they're going to be able to kind of take things out on the opponent with downfield passing attack. It just never really materialized. They were inconsistent throwing the football. The run game was still pretty good at times. And then defensively, there were occasional ebbs and flows from beginning of the year to the very end. But maybe we were just a year early. Because I know that last year coming into it, quarterback play was a question mark to an extent. It ended up being okay. I wouldn't say it was bad. I wouldn't say it was elite. This year, I do think they have an elite talent that will be pulling the trigger for them, and that's Tyler Van Dyke. Now, you're going to sit there and roll your eyes when I tell you that. But I want you to just reflect back to the beginning of last year, first 3-4 weeks of the 2023 season. You realize that Tyler Van Dyke was among the most efficient quarterbacks in the country in the first month of the season last year. And then he got the turnover bug, and he was just never really able to recuperate. What if he can take a 4-game stretch and turn it into an 8, 9, 10-game stretch? Then how dangerous does Wisconsin become? Because remember what Tyler Van Dyke did against a really solid Texas A&M defense last year, right? I mean, he picked them apart from start to finish. Problem is, after the Georgia Tech game, had a couple picks in that game, he was just never really able to get back on track. Now, he moves, fresh start, new lease on life. And remember just a couple years ago with Wisconsin, they had a guy that was very, very talented, but he just couldn't seem to get out of his own way, and all the pressure kind of built up and just was never able to play free. That guy was Graham Mertz. Well, he transfers to Florida last year and had a heck of a season. Now you're going to look at it and say, well, he didn't win a lot of games. Yeah, but you look at his production and his statistical evidence that he was a significantly improved player when he got to Florida. I'm thinking the same thing could happen for Tyler Van Dyke. He throws a beautiful ball. He's got a big arm. He's very accurate. He's just got to avoid the catastrophic mistake, which has at times been troubling for him over the last couple of years. But I'm really optimistic about his fit in that offense, and I do think they're going to have an improved group of weapons around him while still being able to run the football. So Wisconsin is a team that I think we were a little early on last year, but I wouldn't be shocked if they're much better here in 2024 than some people are thinking. Moving on to a team that is flying way under the radar. And so much of the conversation around this team centers around their head coach. And so much around this team kind of centers around whether or not the way that this head coach has approached it is going to continue to be successful here in the modern era of college football. The team I'm talking about are the Clemson Tigers. And you think about Clemson too. Like Clemson last year, really, really shaky in the first 2 months of the season, right? It wasn't pretty. There were 500 football teams at the first 6, 7, or 8 games. It was not good. But down the stretch, starting with the win against Notre Dame, they started to look a little bit more like the Clemson that we grew up with. And for those of you that are in your 30s like me, maybe the Clemson of the late 2010s, maybe we didn't grow up with them, but that's the Clemson that I envision when I still think Clemson and Dabo Swinney. Now, there are question marks around Clemson. No one's denying that. It really centers around their offense, and it centers around their quarterback spot. Because they put so much with that style of attack with Garrett Riley and what he wants to be offensively. So much of that offense is going to center around Cade Klubnik's ability to make good decisions, to be accurate at pushing the ball down the field, and to be solid when the opportunity presents itself to take off, scramble, and maybe make some yards up with his legs. One thing I know for sure, though, is that Clemson's going to have a super elite defense this year. Now, will they be as good as they were back in 2018 when they had 3 or 4 first-round difference-making defensive linemen on their team? I'm not sure they'll be quite as good as that. But if you look at the young pieces that were thrust into the starting lineup after about week 8 or 9 last year, TJ Parker, Khalil Barnes, Avion Terrell, Peter Woods. Those guys got way more time down the stretch, and the biggest jump you make as a player oftentimes is from year 1 to year 2. They were already good in year 1. I can only imagine what they're going to look like in Wes Goodwin's system this year. So I think Clemson is poised to make a big leap defensively. Now it's just about whether or not their offense can follow suit. I think their defense will always keep them in games. But can their offense, in the event in which their defense has a little bit of a shaky outing, can their offense score enough to beat some of the most competitive teams on their schedule? A lot of talk this offseason about Miami, tons of talk about Florida State, rightfully so. You can make a case that those two rosters are the best in the ACC, but don't sleep on Clemson because that defense is built like a championship unit at all 3 levels. And then offensively, if they can get more consistency out of Cade Klubnik, if they can get more consistency out of the run game behind Phil Maffa, their new starting running back. He was situational last year, played a lot, but I think him now becoming the bell cow is going to be even more effective for this Clemson team, becoming more physical and more downhill in the run game. So I think Clemson's a team that's flying under the radar in a really good way for Dabo Swinney and the Tigers. Speaking of Tigers, we're talking a lot. We've already talked about 2 SEC teams already this year. And there's buzz about this team for sure. There's a lot of buzz about this team. Fresh off a Cotton Bowl win, a New Year's Six Bowl appearance, beating Ohio State in that Cotton Bowl. The Missouri Tigers currently, if you were to ask a bunch of people that are going to prognosticate on what the preseason rankings will look like, I think a lot of people have Missouri probably within striking distance of the top 10. Maybe in some cases they have them in the top 7 or 8. Understandable. They have so many pieces back on offense. Brady Cook is back. They've done a great job of making sure that he continues to get more comfortable and more accurate and more decisive. And I think he's been really, really good as the signal caller for the last couple of years. But now I think he's approaching the point where he could be playing his best football, knowing the talented weapons that he has at wide receiver. Luther Burden is elite, the best wide receiver in college football coming back this year. Theo Weiss, many others, they're in a great spot. Yes, it will be hard to replace the presence that was Cody Schrader in the run game. But I think they've done a pretty good job probably acknowledging they're not going to take the bell cow approach this year, but you have a couple running backs that you're able to bring in via the transfer portal that might play a sizable role in you recreating that balanced identity offensively. The big question mark for Missouri are all the pieces that they lost defensively. I'm not talking about just flat out difference maker. I mean, Darius Robinson on the end of the line of scrimmage last year was a handful. Every single game, you could almost count on 2 hands plays and the impact plays that he was going to make. But yes, they lost some really good players in the back end. Lost a couple of really good secondary defenders. Lost a couple really good linebackers. But if you look at how the schedule sets up for Missouri, it would be a massive disappointment if they didn't at least match what they were able to do last year. Your home games are Murray State, Buffalo, Boston College, and Vandy. That should be 4 wins right out of the gate. Auburn, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. They should be favored in each of those 3. So you have 7 games at home in which you should be the favorite football team. Now, a couple tough road games for sure, including a game on the road at Alabama, including a game on the road at Texas A&M. I think those are the 2 toughest games in the schedule, knowing they're away from home and they're against 2 teams with really, really talented players. But all things considered, the rest of the games are very winnable. You go to UMass, you go to South Carolina, you go to Mississippi State. The stars are kind of aligning for the Missouri Tigers, just about whether or not now they can be the hunter or the hunted as opposed to the hunter. Last year, totally flying under the radar. Now there are expectations. Will they be able to handle those expectations is the biggest question mark. And will they be able to adequately replace some of the guys that are gone off that defensive football team? Because they have a good, solid offensive core returning. Moving into the Big 12. And it's still strange for me to say this, but Arizona is now part of the Big 12. I'm still trying to continue to get comfortable with that, but we are here and we are there. They did lose their coach. But when Jed Fish left from Arizona to go and become the head coach of the Washington Huskies, we kind of sat there and we looked at Arizona and said, man, well, they're going to lose all their guys. All right, that's what happens when coaches leave. When they take comparable jobs, they take all their guys with them, and it just pick up right where they left off. The problem is for Jed Fish is that He wasn't able to bring Tetairoa McMillan with him. He wasn't able to bring Noah Fifita with him. And if you look at the Big 12 right now, had the 12-team playoff been in existence last year, and had Arizona been in the Big 12, do you realize that Arizona would have received a first-round bye last year? That's right. A first-round bye last year would have been given to the Arizona Wildcats. It's crazy to think about, but granted, things have changed quite a bit, right? Because Washington wouldn't be in the Big 12, Washington would be in the Big 10, so it's kind of hard to kind of separate all these teams from one another, but they're just put Washington in the Big 10, either Michigan or Washington's getting that first round bye. Let's just give it to Michigan. It means that Washington would have had an at-large. Then you have a scenario where Bama wins the SEC, they would get one. Florida State wins the ACC, they would get one. Texas is in the SEC now, so maybe give them the win over Bama. Bama would not get the first round bye, meaning that Arizona would get that fourth overall selection, which is pretty crazy to think about, but certainly within reason. So when you look at what they have coming back, they could very easily make another run. Now, do have to replace some key pieces on the defensive side, but if you look at their tough games, they're at Kansas State, they're at Utah. Other than that, the schedule is gettable for the Arizona Wildcats and new head coach Brett Brennan. So a team that we're not talking a whole lot about, but we might fast forward to season's end, and they could very well find themselves back in the playoff mix and back in the driver's seat potentially in a Big 12 conference that is certainly up for grabs. Speaking of other teams in the Big 12, how about the fact last year, when you think about the Kansas Jayhawks, a couple years ago, right? A couple years ago, Kansas had hosted College Game Day. Kansas had all the buzz in the world going on. And then they kind of picked right up where they left off last year. They start the season, really good start to the season, sitting there ranked in the top 25. Then Jalen Daniels is out. Starting in week 5, he did not play the rest of the way, had back injury. So Jason Beam had to step in. Jason Beam did a good job filling in admirably for Jalen Daniels. But if you want to just take a step back and look at the most dangerous quarterbacks in the Big 12 right now, a league that has long been predicated on quarterback play. Granted, it's changed a little bit for sure, and there's a lot of new faces in the Big 12. And there's a bunch of good quarterbacks I might add as well. You got Shedeur Sanders, you got Noah Fifita, you got Avery Johnson in at Kansas State. You have Cam Rising at Utah. A lot of really good quarterbacks right now in the Big 12. How many of those guys would you take over a healthy Jalen Daniels? I'm just posing the question. Not saying you have to take all of them. You might take none of them. But when Jalen Daniels, the starting quarterback for Kansas, is right, there's very few in the game that are as dynamic as he is. Not just with the ball in his hands as a runner, but he also improved last year. Granted, just 4 games. Played against Illinois, though, and he chopped Illinois up pretty good. Played against BYU. Looked pretty good in that game as well. Didn't get to play against Texas, but I would have loved to have seen that defense playing against a team that was at full strength with Jalen Daniels at the helm. So I think it's going to be very interesting to watch Kansas. Can they win the Big 12? I don't know. But you have to take into account they are 8-2 in the regular season the last 2 years when Jalen Daniels played the whole game. So you look at just kind of how things stack up with him and how this league has long been dependent on quarterback play. If he can elevate his team, then maybe Kansas can be that fly in the ointment that's flying under the radar right now in the Big 12. And maybe they can find their way to the Big 12 title game. And who knows, maybe Lance Leipold, he's a magician, man. He might be able to find his way into the college football playoff this upcoming season. We have talked not much about the G5. That's because it's kind of hard right now to diagnose who the best teams are in the group of 5. We've talked a little bit about Memphis, but we haven't talked hardly at all about Boise State. And when you look at the ecosystem that is college football and looking at G5 consistency over the course of the last 15, 16 years, now granted, you're going to sit there and say, well, some of the teams that were super consistent in the G5 have now been elevated. UCF, Cincinnati, TCU, a handful of others that once resided in the G5 are now playing Power 5 football. But Boise State's still there. And they added in case some of you forgot, a 5-star quarterback coming out of high school in Malachi Nelson, one of the biggest gets for the G5 in the portal this entire season. And you look at what they have coming back, there's a lot of pieces back at several different positions. And while Taylon Green was a really good player for Boise State last year, he wasn't quite the thrower that Malachi Nelson is. So maybe Malachi Nelson can elevate Boise State to a spot where they could potentially take a shot or take a big swing at one of those college football playoff spots by winning the G5 and securing that automatic bid. And then finally, team that we've talked almost nothing about this year. And it's kind of understandable because if you look at Washington, I'm not going to compare them to the TCU team the year before. That wouldn't be fair because Washington was able to navigate through what was an outrageously deep Pac-12. When TCU came out of the Big 12, they kind of got by the hair of their chinny chin chin, right? A bunch of games that they won at the buzzer, a bunch of comebacks. They did an amazing job. They were able to knock off Michigan there in the Fiesta Bowl. Ultimately got their teeth kicked in against the Georgia Bulldogs, but that Georgia team would have beaten a lot of teams badly in that situation. But we are kind of throwing away Washington as if we threw away TCU last year. Washington still has a bunch of good players off last year's team. Yes, they lost their coach to Alabama, but Jedd Fisch did more with less at Arizona last year than just about anybody in the sport. And while you can look at what was lost, they still potentially have a really solid veteran quarterback back with Will Rogers. Yes, it's a new league. Yes, it's going to be difficult. And a lot of people look back at the performance against Michigan and say, well, they're just not cut out to play Big Ten football on a week-to-week basis. But I would remind you, they were in the game against Michigan. Very much in the game against Michigan until one 3rd and long scramble, which really broke the game open. If they stop J.J. McCarthy there, backed up in the zone end, if they stop and force a punt, they have the ball in prime position to go down and potentially score a touchdown and make that game a whole heck of a lot more interesting. So there were 2, maybe 3 plays that really broke that game open prior to them kind of running it down their throat at the end when the air went out of the balloon. But that Washington team was not far away from a national championship. They were not. Maybe 15, 20 minutes away from a national championship. So can they recreate some magic in the Big Ten? I don't know. All I know is that considering they were just that close to winning a natty last year, we're not talking about them enough. So maybe in the next couple months, we'll spend a little more time on what Jedd Fisch has coming in and what they have to build around, see what they can potentially do in the new league this year. Diving back into our mailbag, and we so appreciate all of you that are submitting questions. We see them all the time, so send them to our email at alwayscollegefootball@gmail.com. You can also always submit questions via social media as well. Always CFB on both Instagram and on Twitter. Jack, where are we going today?
All right, first up, we're going to start with a question from Kyle. He asks, can you name your top 5 targets for the Big Ten in the next round of conference expansion? I read a recent list that had Miami atop the choices, and how about one school that isn't Power 4 that could be a target?
Well, I'll just start by saying this. I don't think there is a school that's not Power 4 that would be a target. Okay, so if you're thinking G5, I can't envision a scenario where the Big Ten would welcome in a team that is currently in the G5. No disrespect, but I don't see that happening. But a team that is not technically a Power 4 team, that is not in a conference currently, I think is atop their list. Now, does the Big Ten ultimately want to get along the Atlantic seaboard? Absolutely. No doubt about it. Do they want to encroach on the Southeastern Conference? More than likely. And I think their television partners are desperate to get into the state of Florida. That would add a lot of scheduling flexibility. You could have more noon games as opposed to the games that would force West Coast schools to potentially play at 9 a.m. local. That, I think, is something that they're going to have to kind of tackle and start to figure out. But the number one team that they would target would be Notre Dame. Notre Dame by a mile. Notre Dame is everyone's number one. Now, like I said, would that be repetitive? In the state of Indiana, you already have Indiana and you already have Purdue. Doesn't matter. You want Notre Dame. That's the number one target for not just the Big Ten. That's the number one target for the ACC, the number one target for the SEC. If Notre Dame decides to join a conference, everyone will throw their hat in the ring. If I were the Mountain West, I'd throw my hat in the ring if Notre Dame were really invested in trying to become a member of a conference somewhere else. So I would say Notre Dame is number one. 2A and 2B, I put kind of on a similar standing. I think Florida State and Miami are both in a similar standing. Now, Miami has the AAU designation. That has been important in the past when evaluating who could potentially make the leap to the Big Ten. But I still think Florida State, with their history, I think it would make some sense, much like they added 2 teams at a time. They added 2 teams from Los Angeles. They added 2 teams from the Pacific Northwest. Would you add 2 teams from Florida at the same time, like Florida State and Miami? I think it would make some sense. It really would. You already have a built-in rivalry between the two as well. And then I think number 3 would be North Carolina. North Carolina is obviously a tremendous basketball school, but also huge media markets in both Raleigh, Charlotte, and a massive national alumni following, not just because of basketball either. They have a pretty rich history when it comes to football. They just haven't been able to get over the hump multiple times. So I would think North Carolina would be next, followed closely by Virginia. I think Virginia would also be a tremendous add given their academic prestige, and it just feels like they would be a great fit for the Big Ten as well. So those would be the 5 schools that I would think the Big Ten would probably target in that order. Notre Dame 1, FSU, Miami 2, North Carolina 3, Virginia would be 4.
All right, next one is from longtime listener Jim from Idaho. He asks, regarding Alabama, do you agree with me that even with the loss of the GOAT Nick Saban, there has been a net improvement in the quality of the coaching staff versus last year?
I don't think that's an unfair thing to say whatsoever, because the head coach, look, it all starts with the head coach. It all stops with the head coach. The buck stops with him, no doubt about it. And yes, replacing Nick Saban is an impossible task. No one expects to, but it is a different era of college football as they move forward. And I think if you look at the coordinators that were on the staff last year, Kevin Steele defensively, offensively, it would be Tommy Rees. I think you can make a case that there is a net improvement defensively, perhaps, with the addition of Kane Womack, who has done a great job in his time at Indiana and did a great job in his time at South Alabama as the head coach the last couple of years. Offensively, there are some questions. Now, I think Nick Sheridan's a good coach, and I think Kalen DeBoer's specialty is the offense. So I think he'll have a really hands-on approach to trying to figure out the best way to attack opposing defenses. So all the way down, Jamarcus Shepard, wide receiver, incredible wide receivers coach. If you want to go on down the list, you can make a case that if you size him up, all right, O-line coach, is Kapilovic an improvement? I don't know. But I think overall, you can make a case with what Washington's staff did last year and how they got the most out of their players. You can make a case that there are some gradual and subtle improvements at a few different positions for sure.
All right, last one here is from Cam. He asks, since we know who is on the cover of College Football 25, who from 2014 through 2024 would you have chosen to represent college football based on the year/season they had?
Well, there's a lot of great options, obviously. There have been so many great players in the last decade. But I think when I think video games, I think about the player that I would have most liked to have had in the video game. And there's really 2 that come to mind for me. Number 1, by a fairly decent size margin, would be Lamar Jackson. I always think about, man, if I had Lamar Jackson and being able to play with him in the NCAA video game, being able to run around, extend plays, find players open downfield, take off and run when I needed to, he'd probably have 98 speed. It'd be absurd what he could do to opposing defenses. So I would say Lamar Jackson would be 1. I would definitely have put him on the cover. Another guy that I would consider would be Johnny Manziel. Johnny Manziel, I just think about just the crazy and chaotic plays that he made, that oftentimes when you were watching Johnny Manziel, it felt like you were watching a video game, didn't it? Didn't it just feel wild to watch him just go out there and completely dominate? So he'd be in the mix. Deshaun Watson would be in the mix from Clemson. He obviously had a great run of success from 2015 and 2016, culminating in a national championship there in 2016. Then I tried to think here in the last couple of years, you got to give some love to the defense, right? Like, defenders need love too. I thought Nick Bosa would make some sense. Of course, played really well there at the end of the 2015 year, 16 year, in that vicinity, 17. So there were a lot of really great moments with him under center. Justin Fields at Ohio State would have been a lot of fun to play with in the NCAA video game. I know that there's probably a million that I'm forgetting. Bryce Young would have been great to play with there at Alabama. He was tremendous in his college career. So there's a ton of great players that would have been awesome to have the opportunity to play with. But man, for me, by far and away, it'd be Lamar Jackson, number one, followed probably there in the 2 spot with Johnny Manziel. Thanks so much for being with us. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Continue to really encourage all of you. Cannot tell you how much it means to us, knowing that you guys are subscribing, seeing our numbers go up, seeing our downloads go up, also seeing our ratings go up. And we appreciate all of you that defended the podcast in the reviews as well. There are some people that are trying to sabotage, but you guys are pushing back, and it means a lot to us that you guys care as much about it as we do. And we know that we will continue to give you the best possible information as it relates to college football all throughout the summer as we head right into media days, and then as we head after media days into fall camp. So hit that subscribe button, hit the like button there. If you're on the ESPN YouTube page, subscribe to the ESPN College Football YouTube page. It supports us. And also continue to submit your questions to the mailbag. Always CFB on both Instagram and Twitter. You can also follow the show on there as well. Then you can submit via our email at alwayscollegefootball@gmail.com. So for all of us here at Always College Football, we hope you have a tremendous day. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.